Monday the 3rd of November 1969. Chapter 3. The first train to arrive at Nettlewood Station from London on a Monday morning arrived at 7:10. On this particular Monday morning it arrived on time, a rare occurrence. Two men wearing smart suits and a long coat stood on the northbound platform in well-polished shoes waiting to board it. Once the carriages came to a complete stop, one of the men opened the closest door and they climbed into the same carriage together. They sat opposite each other, opened their newspapers, and began to read. These same events took place every Monday. Indeed, they happened almost every weekday. The two men had seen each other every morning for years and went through the familiar motions without needing to pass a single word to each other. They would make small talk on their journey regarding the items of interest they found in the news, and ask each other's family occasionally. Today there was a slight change to their routine, as for once someone was alighting the train from their carriage. The man facing down the platform lowered a corner of his newspaper to watch, and then gave his companion a tap with his foot so he didn't miss out. The guard helped the man to lift his 3 cases down from the caged luggage rack above his seat. One of the items of luggage was a briefcase, which the man picked up and carried off. The other cases were large and heavy, and the porter had some trouble removing them from the train. Once the guard had deposited the final case onto the platform next to the man, he tipped his hat politely to him before climbing back into the carriage, slamming the door closed. The station master waved a green flag, blew his whistle, and the train heaved itself out of the station and back on its journey to Birmingham in a flurry of smoke. The man is short, not much over 5 feet tall. He is stocky, with a portly belly. He wears a black bowler hat and a long beige coat. Under this is a well-cut black suit with a grey pinstripe, a white shirt and a red tie. On his face grows a bristly grey moustache interspersed with flecks of red. He stood alone on the platform for a moment before the waiting room door opened and he was approached by a policeman. "Good morning," the policeman greeted him kindly. "I'm Sergeant Frank Gates, Nettlewood Constabulary." He held out his right hand for the man to shake. "As you are the only guest visiting our town this morning, may I presume that you are to be the inspector from Scotland Yard?" The inspector accepted Sergeant Gates' hand and shook it. "Indeed you may, Sergeant." Frank immediately felt relaxed in his presence. He was expecting an officious man, but the inspector greeted him with a smile, and the handshake was firm but warm. The inspector carried with him an air of confidence that only those from the capital can attain. "It was you that put through the call to us in the early hours, yes?" The inspector already knew this to be true, but asked as a matter of formality. "Yes, sir. I contacted you as soon as I received the call from the constable at Firestone." "Very good. There are a lot of questions circling the inspector's mind regarding the report and why it was this man that made it, but he held back on asking them until he had a firmer understanding of the situation and the relationship between the two towns and their police forces. "Shall we go to my car? The poor lad who discovered the body has been there all night and I'm eager to see him," Sergeant Frank Gates said. "Indeed, as I am. Poor chap must be out of his mind with worry, being out there by himself all night. We should get out to him without any more delay. Can I trouble you to assist me with my luggage?" the inspector asked. "Of course, sir. Here." Sergeant Frank Gates picked up the 2 larger cases, leaving the small briefcase for the inspector. They were unfathomably heavy, but Frank struggled silently with their weight. They exited the small station and found the squad car parked closer to the door. As they loaded the cases into the police car's boot, another pulled up. The driver parked in a bus stop that served the station and walked across the car park to where the inspector and Frank had stopped. "Nice parking, Banks," Frank pointed behind him as a bus arrived and was forced to stop on the road, causing traffic to build up behind it. "Police business, Gates. There has been a murder, you know," he replied bluntly in his slow country accent. "What are you doing here anyway?" Banks asked Frank. "I arranged for him to be here," the inspector interjected. "As the body was discovered in Nettlestone's jurisdiction, I thought it best to telephone him and have him drive me to the scene." Neither man paid the inspector any attention. They were locked together in a focus of hatred. Banks broke it, cautious of the man from London. "You must be the inspector down from London." Banks regarded him warily before shaking the inspector's hand. "Yes, Sergeant Banks, is it?" the inspector asked. "I believe you spoke to my assistant." "Yes, that's right. Now, I'm here, Frank. You might as well be off. I can drive the inspector down." "Fine, you can move his luggage into your car then," Frank nodded at the cases in the boot. "Well, Sergeant Banks, as I was saying, Nettlestone is on Frank's beat, and the body was technically discovered in Nettlestone." Suddenly, they both realised that the tables had turned. It took a moment for their surprise to sink in, and for their minds to realign their responsibilities and what was expected of them. Actually, I arranged to meet you both here. I thought it was best, as the body has appeared so close to both your towns." The inspector interrupted their thought processes, and the two men shifted uneasily away from each other. Their mutual hatred was tangible, but the inspector continued briefing them as if he hadn't noticed. "I'll need 2 cars, one at the entrance to the woods so that the ambulance will know where to come, and one to take me to Constable Drew in the clearing, and perhaps attempt a rescue of his vehicle." Both men were rather surprised at how well organised the inspector was. "You've already booked the ambulance?" Banks asked, incredulous, unable to believe that the inspector had taken such liberty. "Yes, it will be there at 8:30, so time is short." The inspector paused for a moment to make it clear that he was changing the subject. "Gentlemen, the 3 of us will be working very closely together as these things pan out, but I want to make it clear that Scotland Yard are now dealing with the case. I'll need you to let me have every rein over your supplies, vehicles, staff, offices, everything. I won't be intrusive, and will ensure that anything used is replaced. I just need to know that you're both going to accept that, so that we can wrap this all up as quickly and as painlessly as possible." The 2 men regarded the inspector carefully. Frank hadn't needed to be told this. He had presumed that would be the case when he received the telephone call at 4 a.m. to tell him that the inspector was on his way and where to meet him. He wondered if perhaps he gave the speech to every rural village he came to, thus ensuring the local constabulary were aware of how things were going to operate. He then wondered if perhaps he had made them aware of this to ensure Banks realised that he was off his turf and he would have to fall in line. "Now, I will travel with you, Frank. Banks, if you follow, hopefully we can find the scene between us." The 3 men returned to their cars without another word. The traffic had dissipated now that the bus had continued along its journey. The cars pulled away, and as they trundled along the quiet main road, their wheels splashed through the deep puddles that remained from the previous night's downpour. The inspector opened his briefcase and pulled out an ordnance survey map, folded open on the 2 towns of Firestone and Nettlewood, and the road in between them. "How was your journey?" Frank asked as they trundled out of the town. "Oh, fine, nothing much to report," the inspector replied. "My train was on time, that's the best one can hope for." The road was long, thin, and winding. As they left Nettlewood, the countryside opened up around them, revealing a patchwork of greys and browns as the farmland slept through the winter. "So the chap we're off to see, Constable Drew Gates," the inspector checked his notes. "Any relation?" he asked. "As a matter of fact, yes, he's my nephew," Frank replied. "I see. Does he match up to your expectations as a police officer?" the inspector asked friendlily. "And more so besides," Frank replied proudly. They gradually made their way up a shallow hill, and on reaching its peak they were confronted with a shallow valley. At its centre a broad expanse of trees stuck obtrusively out of the surrounding fields. The road ahead led directly into the trees. "And this must be Firestone Copse," the inspector announced. "Yes, sir, that's right," Frank replied simply. The wind and rain had calmed from the previous evening, revealing in the thin morning light a dazed town rubbing its bruises. They descended into the valley, and soon the car was entering the trees. Their branches hung over the road, making a tunnel that did all it could to block out the dim early morning sun. The inspector had marked on the map his best guess as to where the body might be. He had based this on his conversation with Frank the previous night. Frank, the inspector noticed, did not require a map. He drove confidently along the road, his eyes searching the undergrowth for any evidence of the story that had been relayed to him by Drew. "He should be along here somewhere then," the inspector asked Frank as they turned the corner onto Beeper Chute. "Yes," Frank replied. He slowed for a second. "Look, there's the stump of the fallen tree." Both men surveyed the damage. The tree had obviously been cut recently. The wood was still fresh from the saw, and a few flakes of sawdust remained, drenched and stuck to the tarmac. "Must have been a hell of a job to clear it in the weather we had last night," Frank exclaimed. "Was the weather truly bad?" the inspector asked. "Aye, one of the worst storms I've seen," he replied. Banks's car suddenly came up behind them and slowed as it approached. The inspector angled his head to watch him in the rearview mirror, and noticed that he paid no attention to this tree or what they were doing. He sat in his car swearing, waiting for them to start moving again. Frank took the car slowly forwards, looking for the same thing the inspector was, tyre tracks into the trees. After an agonisingly slow cruise along the road, Frank finally saw them. "The rain last night made it so muddy. Look, you can see his tracks right through the grass." Sure enough, tyre tracks disappeared into the trees where wheels had been bent over the grass a few hours earlier. A few hours more, and the grass would have grown its height, and the trail would be lost. Frank reversed up a little and turned into the directions of the tracks, following the tyre path through the grass. His tyre slipped a little on the muddy verge, but once he was on the vegetation, the car found it easy going. The track was not a track at all, just a wide path through the trees where nothing grew. Their car was submerged in the brambles and branches as they tore their way through. Then, quite abruptly, the scraping stopped. They were in a wide, open space dominated by huge bare oaks stretching around them. The opening dipped down at the centre, where a police car sat facing a tarpaulin laid out on the ground. At the top of the crater stood a policeman with his right hand up, indicating for them to stop. Chapter 4. Drew woke shortly before sunrise from a thin sleep. His dreams had been riddled with glowing eyes following him through confusing mirrored corridors. It took him a moment to remember where he was, and the memory made his heart sink. A few stubborn crows sat in the surrounding trees, cawing, determined to bear out the English winter. Their calls made a quiet chorus to signal the arrival of the new day. He hugged the blanket around his shoulders for warmth and looked out of the window into a drizzle-lined grey sky. He took a few sips of water and began rousing his tired body into action. He pulled his boots on and left the relative comfort of the squad car's back seat to examine the scene in the first meagre rays of the new day. His boots squelched through the mud, which had dried a little since the rain ceased and so was slightly easier to navigate through. He made his way to the front of the car, where the sheet of tarpaulin he had placed there still sat, covering the corpse. It was pinned down along its edges with some heavy stones he had carried down from around the lip of the crater. In the centre, the dead man's shape loomed conspicuously. Drew was tired, and still in a degree of shock from the events of the last few hours. He could still not quite place the body into his perspective of the world. It still did not seem real. The trees now stood perfectly still around him, his silent protectors against the hidden depths of the forest that lurked behind them. The storm had passed. The morning was cold, but with the dulling of the gale came a sun determined to warm the wet land. As its heat penetrated the cold floor, a mist rose unwillingly and lurked low around the trunks. The crows became a little more determined in their song, as if trying to sing away the feeling of menace between the trees. Drew heard the cars before he saw them. The sound of their engines and of the brambles scratching across metal came echoing through the trees. He made his way haphazardly out of the crater and reached the summit just as they exited onto the mud. At this level, the ground was drier, the mud wasn't as thick, and the cars were less likely to become stuck. He held up his hand for them to stop, and Sergeant Gates wound down his window. "Morning, Drew. How are you?" he asked in a tone of concern. "Fine, Sarge. Tired and in a little shock, I think, but otherwise all right." Banks drove into clearing behind them, leapt out of his car, and immediately made his way towards Drew. Who did his best to hide his disappointment. "Good," Frank replied, unable to hide his relief. The passenger door of his car opened and the inspector climbed out. "This is the inspector, down from Scotland Yard. He's here to investigate the body," Frank informed him. The inspector climbed out of the car and around to Drew before Banks could reach him. Frank noticed what he was trying to do and climbed out to cut Banks off. "Good to meet you, Drew." The inspector shook his hand while Frank grabbed Banks and began educating him in the highway agency's responsibilities. He led him inconspicuously away from the two men. "Did you mean what you said about feeling fine, or were you just being brave?" the inspector asked him. "No, I meant it," he replied with conviction, though his haggard face said otherwise. "Good, because I need to ask you some questions, now, before the memories of last night begin to fade, or your mind begins altering them. No one would blame you if you weren't feeling up to these questions." "No, I understand the importance of asking them straight away. Would you like to go to the body?" The inspector took a long look at the wide space in the trees. "I do indeed, but I think it might be better traversed in Wellingtons. I see you stopped us here to prevent us becoming trapped in the mud." "Yes, hopefully it'll be dry enough soon to drag my car out. We also have an ambulance arriving in an hour or so, leaving me eager to get on with the job before they arrive to take him away." He made his way to the arguing sergeants. "Excuse me, gentlemen, I am sorry to interrupt." The men turned to face the inspector. Banks was pink in the cheeks with rising anger, while Frank smirked at his success at annoying his contemporary. "Sergeant Gates, would you be so kind as to open your boot and allow me access to my luggage?" "Of course, Inspector." He left the fuming Banks and went to open the boot. "Sergeant Banks, could you drive back to the road and wait for the ambulance to arrive, please?" Banks stood staring after Frank for a moment, then turned and left without a word. As there was no space to turn around without becoming stranded in the mud, he was forced to reverse back down the narrow space between the trees. The inspector and Drew joined Frank at his car boot. The inspector manoeuvred the cases in the generous boot space and opened the larger of the two, revealing a plethora of outdoor survival equipment such as a small tent, wet weather overalls, thermal coat, compass, rations, and a pair of green Wellingtons. The inspector perched himself on the edge of the boot space and changed his shoes. He did so with such casualness that both police officers were a little surprised. He placed his brown leather shoes in the space that the boots had occupied in the case, and then closed its lid again. He opened a compartment in its lid and took out a camera, some spare rolls of film, and a large circular tape measure. These vanished into his briefcase. He then pulled out a plastic bag from a compartment at the bottom of the case and took from it an unopened tin of white paint and a thick brush. "Now I am ready to see the body." He removed the camera from his case, put it to his eye, and took a picture of the scene from where he stood. The abandoned car, the blue tarpaulin, the big muddy hole. "Sergeant Gates, would you please remain here and await the arrival of the ambulance?" "Of course, Inspector." Frank watched as he dished out instructions, impressed by the finesse and character with which he did it all. "Drew, if you would accompany me." The inspector led the way, following the path that Drew's footprints made in the mud that led down to the centre of the crater. "So tell me what happened last night. How did you come to be in here and find the body?" the inspector asked. "How much do you already know?" "I want to hear your side of the events." They had arrived at the car. "Start at the beginning." Drew took a deep breath. "Well, I removed the tree from the road, then drove a little way from the bend to turn around. Then—" He paused for a moment as he remembered the eyes. He was cautious about how much he wanted to share with this man. He was aware how the circumstances leading up to his arrival in the opening sounded, and he didn't want to seem foolish to an important inspector down from London. "I noticed this opening, so I drove down here to have a look." "Impressive. It can't have been easy to see in the rain and the dark. What was it made you notice it?" the inspector asked, gently probing Drew, wondering if the inspector Drew wondered if the inspector already knew what he had seen and was trying to convince him that he could confide it. Drew remained silent, thoughtful. The inspector let him think, gauging the young man, reading his thoughts, allowing him time to trust him. "As time is short, perhaps we should learn about how you got here later. For now, tell me what you found when you arrived." Drew was grateful for the change in subject. "I drove through the trees, and when I arrived here in the opening, I did not see the dip until it was too late. The car slid down the slope and I was unable to stop it, and it got stuck." The inspector studied the constable's car. Each wheel sat in a deep trench, carved out in the rain and dark of the previous night. He turned his attention to the door and the tracks that started there, following them as Drew told his story. "So I got out and checked the back tyres to see how stuck I was, then I went to the front." Drew paused, thinking. He had looked about for the eyes, but he couldn't tell the inspector that. "And was the body there?" the inspector asked. "If it was, I didn't notice it," Drew consciously editing the eyes from the story. "When I realised I was stuck, I sat back down in the front seat. I was still knackered from moving the tree, and when I began to drop off, I woke up to turn the lights off and call in my position, and that's when I saw it." He paused as the memory of the body in the night played back across his mind. "The shock was doubled by the surprise," he admitted. "It wasn't there before. I would have seen it. I'm sure I would have seen it." The inspector had been following the trail of footprints up to this point, and had noticed a second trail leading to the front. "So then you got out again and walked around to the front to get a better view?" "Yes, just to make absolutely sure it was actually there." "Did it look fresh?" The inspector had to ask direct questions, but Drew wasn't sure if he liked it. "Sorry, perhaps I shouldn't be so callous. You have been through a lot tonight after all." "No, it's fine. It's funny because I know what you mean. It looked as though it had been placed there the moment I looked up. Like I happened to be looking at the right place at the right time, and suddenly it was there. It took me a few seconds, but I was out of the car quite quickly. It was still steaming when I got to the front. It just kept bleeding and bleeding. There was a lot of blood." Drew fought back the impulse to vomit at the thought. "And then you searched the area, looking for footprints, clues, trying to see if there was any trace of a culprit?" The inspector had noticed the prints leading up to the edge of the trees. There were a few trails leading off back to the car, and as he had prepared the site, covered the body, and a trail leading off when he had retrieved the stones. Yes, there was nothing I could see, though I couldn't see an awful lot in the dark. Then you covered the body. Yes, indeed. I thought it might be a good idea. Yes, the inspector agreed. We don't want the poor chap exposed to the elements. Drew had been too immersed into the replaying of the night to notice that the inspector was taking photographs of the ground, the car, the footprints, each piece of the scene committed to celluloid. He turned to face Drew. "Shall we have a look at him?" the inspector asked. Drew led him along the side of the car, retracing his path. They came to the blue tarpaulin. In its centre rose the ominous bulk of the corpse. The inspector removed the rocks from one edge and gently rolled the plastic sheet back. When the body was fully revealed, he put the rocks back onto the sheet to hold it in place. A dark red patch in the surrounding earth was now all that remained of the pool of blood that had immersed from the body. The clothes were filthy and drenched in blood and mud. The inspector began taking pictures of it all. "Was there any blood at all when you found it?" he asked as the camera clicked. "Only a little. More came out as I watched." The inspector knelt down to study it. "Did you notice this when you saw it? Did you notice this when you saw it?" Drew looked over at the back of the body. A large hole descended through the chest. Blood pooled at the base. "No, I didn't. I didn't look too closely, if I'm honest." The inspector took a few photographs of the hole, and the film ran out. He took a film from his case and reloaded the camera, then removed the tape measure, and with Drew's help he measured the body. The length and angle of every limb was scribbled carefully into a little notebook. When he was satisfied, he carefully painted around the corpse to leave a white line in the shape of the body on the mud. Not a drop went out of place. The dead man's clothes remained untarnished. When the paint dried, he took more photographs of the wound. "What was the weather like last night when you drove up here?" the inspector asked between photographs. Drew took a moment to answer through the haze of sleep deprivation. "Atrocious. I'm amazed I managed to shift that tree in it. Driving conditions were horrendous. The entire night was a nightmare," he admitted candidly. "What about when you reached this spot? What was it like here?" Hidden behind the camera, Drew was unable to tell if the inspector asked this because he knew the conditions were different. Drew took a moment to answer again, trying to decide if he should tell the inspector the truth, whatever it might be. As if sensing this turmoil, the inspector lowered the camera and spoke to Drew quite directly and confidently. "Perhaps I should explain. There is no ramification for telling the truth. I want to hear what you saw, everything you witnessed. There is no need for you to be worried about what it might sound like to me." Drew felt reassured, as he had already decided to tell the truth. He nodded in understanding. It was very still here. The trees on the outer edge, he pointed around the perimeter of the circular opening, were swaying in the wind, but down here, there was no wind at all. Was it raining? Drew thought for a moment. No, it was wet on the ground, obviously, as the car was stuck in the wet mud, but it was dry otherwise. The clouds were all around the edge, but they didn't stray over the clearing. He thought for a moment. "Was the tarp dry when you rolled it up?" he asked. The inspector was beginning to like the way Drew's mind worked. "No, it was dry, but it is a dry morning. Yes, the clouds must have parted about the same time I arrived here. I remember seeing the moon." The inspector checked the paint with his finger. It had dried quickly. "Okay, I'm going to turn him over. Could you manage the feet?"